Over to you, Doc.
Thank you very much. Is this working? I think that the discussion so far has been very interesting, and I'd just like to maybe, before I start on what I prepared, to just reflect on three things. So one is the four types of access that we've talked about there. The second one is the issue that universities can't actually be expected to solve every social problem. And then the third one is really, if we look at our system as a whole and what the need in society is, we can't expect everybody to go to university. And I think it's a critical issue that we have to deal with. I just quickly looked at some of the data that we had on the number of students, or number of people, citizens, South African citizens that are over 20, and what their educational attainments are. And we have 1.7 million with no formal schooling at all, 3.5 million with some primary schooling, 1.6 who completed the primary school, and then we've got 12.79 which have some secondary schooling but have not completed. Those are millions. So that comes to about 18 million individuals in society who require education and training of some sort or another, but are definitely not going to be coming to universities. And of those who complete the matric every year, maybe 20-30% of them could go to a university, and that's even stretching it. So what have we got in our system? We've got a system that's made up of a university education, which has an enrollment of around about 1 million. We have a TVET system, which has an enrollment of about 700,000. And we have a community education and training, or adult education system, which has about 300,000. And that's one of our biggest problems. We have a system that doesn't fit the need of our country. And when we talk about how we're going to actually deal with it, we have to deal with it as well as strengthening higher education with expanding the TVET and community education sector. And I think we have to deal with that in a context where we have huge fiscal problems. I take your point about the nuclear program or whatever, but that's all talk at the moment. I don't know whether there's funding to support such a thing. So we have to really consider it within that kind of context. So when we're talking about growing student success in the university education system, which is what I'm going to try to focus on, and I'm going to look at it from a systemic point of view, I think we have to be thinking about a number of different linked areas. And it does reflect something on what's been said before. If just in terms of some basic principles, if we talk about access and success, these are interlinked. So what does it mean? Who gets access to what, and how do we do it? And thinking about the four types of access that you mentioned, Ahmed. What does it mean to get that access and to succeed? How do we link those two in very direct ways? We're talking about students and staff here. That's interlinked, because the point that was made about staff getting lots of support and students not getting the support, well, what does that mean, and how do we deal with it within our context? We can't be thinking about teaching, learning, and researching as different things either within this context. And I think that from our understanding, we have to think about achieving success along the entire academic study and career continuum. So it's all the way through, from basic education all the way through. And what is the linkage between that and all these other social issues that we know exist in the system? But what we're trying to do now is to say we need an evidence-based approach. We need data about the system that can inform choices of areas for action and the strategies that are put in place. And that data, on one hand, is just numbers about what's happening in the system, but there's other kind of data as well, real research about what it is in in practical situations that lead to a lack of success in any particular aspect. And some of the things we know are linked to things like funding and food and support and so on. But what kinds of things can we do something about in higher education? I think we have to make those distinguishing things. And we have to think about this work systemically. Now, I'm just going to take some hard numbers here, which are just simple ones, around some of the indicators when we talk about academic success in an institution. And if we talk about the success rate, as we calculate it, which is linked to the number of courses passed, you can see there that the success rates in undergraduate programs has increased from 2004 to 2014. So it's quite a big increase. We've got some target that says we should get to by 2030 to about 80%. But that hides a lot of things underneath it, because although those success rates seem to be okay if you think about those numbers, the problem is when you translate that into dropouts and throughput rates. So if we look then at the next line, which is the first year dropout rate for undergraduate programs, and this is overall the entire system, we see that we do have an improvement. It was 31.5% in 2000 for the 2000 cohort, and it was 19.1% for the 2012 cohort. Now that's a big improvement. Can we get it down to 15%? That's a question. And what does that really mean in terms of why have we got this improved situation? What is underlying it? Is it really improved? And that's the issue of quality we have to ask. But we really need to look below those figures to understand what it is and how we can then improve it in a way that really has substance. If we look at the cohort throughput rates, after 6 years in contact programs, we see there's also been an improvement from 49.3% in, I've only got 5 minutes, I think I've had very little time here, but anyhow. But we can see there that we've got a big improvement. And the shocker really is our cohort throughput rate in distance programs after 10 years. I think that number, and you will understand that when we look at the overall rates, they are very much affected by that number, because we have more than 350,000 of the million students in higher education in distance programs. So what is it? How do we understand these things? There's this issue of entry into higher education. We know about the basic education system. Can we use data to assist us with placement and advice? And that links to this whole issue of career advice as well. Is there a way in which we can use data analytics upfront, not to be discriminatory, but to identify what the needs are of individuals coming into the system? What kind of data? How would we use it? And can we link it into our central application service that we are currently developing? If we could, and we could advise students more effectively to get them into the right kinds of study spaces and places, we may be able to assist people in developing sustainable livelihoods in a better way. We have to look at this issue of success through distance education modes and the use of technology. What are the pedagogic issues? How do we deal with this? If we're thinking about growing the system and providing sufficient spaces for all those people who require it, we have to look at this. And what kind of research do we need to be able to deal with this? And then there's a question of quality. What do we mean by quality? It's one of those things that's very difficult to put our fingers on, but we have to make sure that when we do this, we provide access, and this success is real. It is epistemic access. It is access to powerful forms of knowledge. It does relate to people's lives and enable them to become economically productive. So we have to think of that. okay, what are the systemic levers in promoting student success from the Department of Higher Education's point of view? Well, we have earmark grants which are used to steer the system. And the key ones are NSFAS, which provides funding for financially needy students. And although it's not enough and it hasn't supported people enough, it has been huge. You know, more than 1.5 million young people who would never have been in higher education have been supported through NSFAS. There's a foundation provisioning, looking at the development of extended programs and assisting in that way. There's the teaching development grant and the infrastructure and efficiency grants. And I want to stress this issue of student housing. It's an absolutely critical one, and Adam, you're right, it is something that has to be dealt with at a much broader level. We can't expect universities to house every student, every poor student, but we have to find a way of dealing with it. If we look at that data and we dig a little bit deeper, we can see many kinds of underlying patterns that exist. And this one just tries to pick up this issue around the success rates and looking at the distance. I don't know if you can read it clearly enough, but it definitely is linked to various kinds of apartheid demographic patterns. So if we look at the success rates, firstly, in terms of distance, you'll see they're much lower than the rest, the overall success rates. So it's 54% success rate in 2004 compared to 77.8 in 2014 of the whole cohort. And then if you look at those key areas, colored students, African students, and male students. Very interesting. We have to look at that issue of male and female students. Female students somehow, although they're not seen so much in the academia and the sort of higher levels of staff, are definitely more successful. But what is it? What is it? What's behind this? And how do we deal with it? If you look at this throughput rate for undergraduate programs, and we're looking now at contact and distance, you'll see how skewed it is. But then again, let's look at those particular groups of students and understand what is going on there. So if we look at our colored students, you'll see there that the throughput rate for undergraduate students after 6 years was in 2000, the overall, not contact after 6 years was 37%, and that's improved to 46.5%. But compare that to 49.3 and 61.4. So we can see there that as a whole group, that group of students is not going through the system in the same way as other groups are. And if you look at African students, it's slightly less as well. Now, what does this mean? I don't think in this country that we can actually ignore these kinds of statistics. We have to start looking down to different groups, and we have to try to understand what does this mean and why, and what kinds of things we have to put in place to deal with them. And again, you can see we've put the males there because you can see they're quite far behind as a group compared to the total. So we have it. And then obviously distance education, still a problem. So if we're going to think about where we're going to get to, well, could we move it to a 30% throughput rate after 10 years? That seems low, but really, if we can't get there, that's going to be a problem. And we also have to look at this at postgraduate level. We can't only look at it at undergraduate level. And looking here, you can see again, just in terms of the basic South African racial groupings, what the difference is in terms of the dropouts. I know I have to stop, but I'm going to go for 2 more minutes if that's okay. I just want to make another point, is that when we look at these things in the cohort studies for actual fields as well, there's a big difference. For example, business and management studies is the worst. Well, we can all imagine those first year pro classes when there are 1,000 people sitting trying to listen to a lecture, and the best are MBCHBs. Not surprising, given the entrance requirements and so on. But we have to think about that, and we have to understand what that means. So we've got a leaking funnel system. We put lots of people in at the top, and they leak out all the way along, and we have to deal with a situation where we can really stop these inefficiencies and wastefulness, and we cannot continue to reproduce inequality, not within our context. We have to understand what that means, and we need to be looking deeply below these types of statistics to really understand what it is. Now, some of the things do have to do clearly with basic funding, with support and so on, but what do? So we are in the process of finalizing a university capacity development program. This will be funded through putting together the research development funds and teaching development funds currently in system, which comes to about 1 billion at the moment. And I'll have 3 different kinds of initiatives. The one will be very focused on student development and student support. The next would be on program development initiatives, and there we're talking very specifically about these kinds of things. What kind of curriculum do we have? What kind of knowledge are we talking about in terms of access? How do we develop those things? And then the last one on staffing. So looking across them. In terms of the improving success, this diagram just tries to put together some of those aspects that we have to think about. From the admission side, how do we understand who's coming into our system? How do we deal with this from there all the way through to graduation? Utilizing data analytics, developing early warning systems, creating really strong student advisory services to support students in all kinds of aspects, both social, and psychologically and academically. And then we have a number of different types of programs that we're looking at. So the foundation programs, first year experience programs, etc., to help us bring this together. And lastly, I'll just flash this, I won't talk about it. We have the Staffing South Africa's Universities framework, which people are aware of, which is about supporting lecturers to become better teachers and researchers and ensuring that we have a strong system. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there are an amazing number of responses from DHET that are there. I particularly like the last 2 slides that we had, and I hope we can make those more widely available to everybody. We are running short of time, but we are ending with one of the absolute key issues, which is Sizwe Nxazana is going to speak to us about what the Ministerial Task team is about.
So I'm going to talk today not as chairman of NSFAS, even though I'm going to touch on some of the aspects that relate to the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. I'm going to particularly talk about the new student funding model and student support model, which is being developed as part of the Ministerial Task team, which I have the privilege of chairing. So maybe just a little bit of context. The National Student Financial Aid Scheme, as you probably know, was created from a platform which was the Tertiary Education Support Program, TEFSA, which was an NGO before. And NSFAS operates in terms of the NSFAS Act. And when you look at the mandate of NSFAS, it's quite narrow, because all that the NSFAS Act says is that NSFAS is there to provide financial support to the needy students. We have to collect the debt from the loans that are granted. We have to advise the Minister of higher education in terms of issues that relate to student funding. But the NSFAS Act doesn't say anything about the kind of support, additional support, in addition to financial support that we should be giving to students. And that's one of the reasons why you continue to see, for instance, some of the practices that have developed over time in terms of how NSFAS operates. In other words, universities and TVET colleges are sort of agents of NSFAS. And in the process, we have practices that have developed over time, like top slicing, like underfunding of students, no support at all, or even no interest by NSFAS in terms of what program students are registering for, how they're progressing, what happens to them after they graduate, and so on. So the Ministerial Task Team, which I chair, is trying to address some of those gaps and some of the issues which NSFAS is not addressing at the moment. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to look at the NSFAS Act, and in any case, DHET had already started the process of reviewing the NSFAS Act and whether it was still relevant and appropriate for the current conditions in the country. Secondly, NSFAS gets 100% of its funding from government, from national government, other government departments like Department of Higher Education and Training, Science and Technology, the provinces, the CETAs, and so on. And there's absolutely no money that comes from other sources. Part of it is because of the restrictions in the NSFAS Act itself that restricts, NSFAS from the ability, for instance, to raise funding from other sources. But the other is just because of the bad reputation that we have at NSFAS, that, we used to have some funding that came from, for instance, philanthropic organizations or from corporate social investment programs, but over time, that funding has completely disappeared. So we've got to address that issue. And thirdly, just in the context of the hashtag fees must fall, but also the reality of what the poor students face. Is there a feasibility of providing fully subsidized support to the very poor students? Are we investigating that issue? And how do we align our strategies in terms of funding and support to the strategies of the country, especially the National Development Plan, in terms of the production of the scarce skills, the so-called occupations in high demand? Because I can tell you now at NSFAS, we don't really focus on that. We do have some funds that are allocated, for instance, from the National Skills Fund or from the CETAs that are dedicated to scarce skills, but they are by far the smallest piece of the total funding pool that we have at NSFAS. And how do we deal with the reduction of dropout rates? I indicated, and Di has already shared, and there are many different cohort studies that have been done that show that the dropout rate for the poor students at NSFAS range somewhat between 45% and 63%, depending on which statistics you want to believe. So we've got to deal with that issue. Which NSFAS has never really dealt with. And then how do we make sure that we have an efficient system? Because, at the moment we're trying to improve the efficiencies at NSFAS, so we've put in a lot of resources to try and improve those efficiencies, but the whole architecture of NSFAS is an NGO architecture. I know there are NGO people here, but it was never designed to deal with today the 15 billion rand budget that NSFAS is dealing with the loan component for those students who are receiving loans, even with the data analytics that are required for us to understand what it is that is happening in the system, what's the consequence of the funding that we are providing. There's just no data analytics capability at all. So we've got to build that in the new model. And when you look at the white paper, again, it is important in this country, sometimes we operate in silos. It is important that we are aligning the objectives of what we're trying to do in student financial aid, as well as the support that is provided to students with the higher education or the post-school education and training white paper. So it talks about a number of issues in terms of fairness, equity, non-racialism, the expanded access, improved quality, all of the issues that Diane Parker and others have spoken about. So it is important as we develop a new model that we're not at cross purposes with the model that, with the direction that the country is taking. And talking about the direction of the country, the Deputy President of the country chairs the Human Resources Development Council. This is in support of the National Development Plan. So if you didn't know, this country now has an integrated human resources development strategy. It's the first time in the last 2 years that the country has an integrated human resources development strategy. We've never had one before. Maybe it existed under apartheid for a small group of people that were benefiting. But the fact of the matter is we now have a Human Resources Development Council. It identifies what this country needs to do from a human capital standpoint if we are going to achieve an economic growth rate of 6% plus. So, you know, and I'm quite privileged to be a council member of the HRDC. So what we're trying to do in developing the new model is also to align ourselves with the HRDC and the number of programs that are part of the HRDC. There's a program 2 which talks about the TVET colleges, program 3 which is supporting higher education and training, including research, and program 4 which talks about the kind of skills that are required from a transformed society. So the new model that we are developing is trying to address all of these issues. So we started, you know, I got appointed through the Ministerial Task team in April this year. We've already developed a blueprint of how the new model is going to work. So this is a summary. I only got 10 minutes, so I won't go into a lot of detail. It's a summary of how the new model is different from the current NSFAS model. So for starters, we'll cover the so-called missing middle. We're still working on models of where the cutoff point is going to be and how much we can afford, but it is essentially going to be certainly more than 2 times the current means test that we apply at NSFAS. In other words, it's going to be more than 240,000 rand, because NSFAS only funds students that come from households that earn 122,000 and less. So we're looking at pushing that number as high as we can. Secondly, we'll have so there are students that are going to get fully subsidized education, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But for those students who get a portion which is a loan, that loan, depending on the means test, will have a varied interest rate. I think the most important part of the difference is just the design of how the funding itself is going to work. So NSFAS, at the moment, if you come in at first year, you qualify for NSFAS funding, you get 100% loan. That loan may be top slice, it may be 20,000 instead of 71,800, which is the funding cap that we have at NSFAS. Why? Because universities have been allowed over time, as well as TVET colleges, to, instead of giving funding to one student, they spread it across a number of students, and that results in underfunding of the students, which is another contributing factor to the failure rate. So what we're trying to do here is to offer the full cost of study, but instead of giving a loan, so if in NSFAS at the moment you drop out after your first year, 100% of that amount that you received for something you never got is actually a loan that you must repay. And I mean, we know that, for instance, you know, last year, I can't give you this year's numbers, last year's numbers, out of a total loan book of 21 billion rand that we're sitting with at NSFAS, our total collections were 248 million rand. Why? Because you have a number of people, there are inefficiencies at NSFAS which we're trying to fix, but also the number of people who simply are unemployed because they got loans, they dropped out at first year, and how do you expect them to repay these amounts? And the same applies to drop-offs that happen at second year, you know, which lead to or contribute to the unemployed people that we have in the country. So in the new model, what we're trying to do is let's offer more grant funding for the more at-risk students in the earlier years of study. So your first year, you get more grants as opposed to loans. And in fact, for the very poor students, they'll probably get a fully subsidized with a lot of the wraparound support, which is important for those students. And then as they progress in the university or TVET system, if you're getting a loan component or a portion of a loan, the loan starts to kick in your second, third, and successive years of study. Because by then, your chances of dropping off have hopefully reduced, especially given all the wraparound support that you will get as a student in the system. And in any case, you are getting closer to graduation where you can repay us as opposed to expecting you to repay NSFAS when in fact you're not even qualified or you haven't graduated. So the number of things in the design which are important policy changes that are going to be required in terms of how the new model is going to work compared to the current model. So from a student standpoint, what are we trying to do? So what we're trying to do in the new model is to make sure that we provide full support to students. You know, Mashudu talked about, you know, the gaps that currently exist in accommodation. So there are norms and standards that have now been gazetted, approved by the department, by the minister, in higher education and training. So for those people who are staying off campus, we will make sure that we can only fund people who are staying in approved accommodation, not in shacks, not in drug and crime-infested areas. Secondly, it is important that we give students all of the wherewithal which they're required to progress, which includes accommodation, food, and other incidentals. You know, Mashudu talked about sanitary pads as an example. It is important that the funding is provided to students to be able to cover those incidentals because they're important in supporting them and in maintaining their dignity in the course of their study. So the students will deal with, obviously, the universities. They'll be given devices that are important for them to progress. They will be given additional support, which may be other on-campus support, because, you know, the support that should be given to students has to be tailor-made. A student who's doing medicine doesn't necessarily require all of the same support as a student who's doing engineering. Doesn't require the same kind of support as a student who's doing a humanities degree. So you have to tailor the support according to the programs because the issues are the same. Yes, the students may come with the same kind of baggage. They may come with learning difficulties because the language of instruction and therefore comprehension is difficult. So, you know, enhancing just their academic English, as an example, is really important across the board. But there are very unique and very specific issues for each faculty, for each program which they may be doing, which stops them. You know, there are certain programs that are easier in the earlier years and require a lot more cognitive problem-solving, analytical thinking skills later on. But others are exactly the other way. So you've got to tailor that support to those students for them to be able to succeed. And obviously, there's other support which will be required, which will be provided to the students in the form of psychosocial support, study or academic support, life skill support, social support, and so on, which has to be integrated in a way where we can leverage, especially if you're going to scale this across the 26 public universities and across the 50 TVET colleges in the country spread around 253 campuses. It is important that you're able to scale this in a way that is affordable. So using technology and data analytics in the process is particularly important, which is why I'm really interested in what the University of Georgia has to offer in this regard and some of the experiences they have. So we want to provide this integrated support so that from a student standpoint, it is easy, it is more integrated, it makes it more convenient to students, because very often, I mean, I can tell you now, we talk about the student-centered model that we are rolling out at a number of institutions that Mashudi was referring to, you know, and I've looked at it and I must be honest, I mean, it's not really student-centered. Because you have to have this coupon, it has to work on this particular cell phone technology. You can't transact like you and I can transact, where you can use online, you can use an app, you can use a card, and so on to be able to transact. So we want to create that level of flexibility and convenience to students in the system. And just very briefly, how the student support is going to work is, if you are really poor, at the bottom, the blue is the grant component, the white component in that triangle is the loan component. So if you are very poor, let's take, for instance, students that come from households that receive social grants. It goes without question that those students cannot be expected to have, or the families cannot be expected to have a family contribution, because government gives those people grants. So how do you expect that person who's getting a grant of 2,000 a month to afford to send their children to university? So as a starting point, I think this country can afford to give those students fully subsidized education as a minimum, at a minimum. So, you know, those are the students at the bottom. And then obviously we want to raise funding from all different sources, from development financial institutions, from NGOs, from corporate social investment programs, but there's even commercial funding, on the basis that the loan component will return interest which can actually sustain the payout of an investment return to those people that are going to be putting money at the top. So these are retail investors. You and I can invest, just like we invest in a retirement bond, you'll invest in a student support bond that gives you a certain return over a certain period of time. we're looking at creating some of the instruments like that. We're looking at creating social impact bonds, particularly to address the issue of improving success rates, employability of students, and reduction of dropout rates. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So the way that the system is proposed to work is that once the student has been accepted at a university or a TVET college, they will then, at the same time, would have applied for funding. ISFAP is really just a code name. It's called IGUSASA Student Financial Aid Program. In short, it's a new NSFAS. So you'll apply there, and the way that the application process is going to work is decentralized. So we're going to take away the current process where you have financial aid offices that sit in university or TVET colleges, which is fraught with all sorts of problems, including in certain cases corruption. So we're going to have a centralized system utilizing the latest processes and technologies. The government is working on a central application service, so we'll link into the central application service because that gives us a lot of efficiency. So when students are in grade 11 already, and hopefully, and I'm quite privileged here because I work with the Department of Basic Education, and talking about career guidance. If you look at the DHET's CATA program, which is a career guidance program, it is absolutely critical for that program to be integrated earlier on. When students are making selections at grade 8, career guidance, that's where they select the subjects. And there's a perverse incentive here in basic education that, basic education is driving the improvement of results. The consequence of that is that you find a lot more kids selecting, for instance, life orientation, maths literacy, which don't really give them the ability to choose some of the subjects that improve their chances of success. Yes, you then have statistics that show that the results in this country, matric results that is, are improving, but the quality of those results is something that we need to question. So it's the same thing here when we look at dropout rates. We can't just focus on reducing the dropout rate without looking at the quality of the programs that the students are doing. Because, we're not going to meet the objectives of our National Development Plan and understand that humanities degrees and social sciences are required in the world, are required in our country. But the key issue that we have in this country is one of balance. Because if we have an oversupply of social scientists and we don't have, the president of the SRC at DUT was talking about career guidance always about STEM subjects. It is important as a country that we're striking that balance, that we have enough of the people and students that are pursuing some of these STEM subjects. Because otherwise, we know the supply and demand equation that we have in the country at the moment is not the one that we should be having if we are going to deal with the issue of economic growth and so on. So what we're hoping to do here through the CAS, the Central Application Service, is to be able to link with Basic Education Department to have a much more robust and integrated career guidance program that ensures that when students are making selections about the programs which they're going to study, which institutions they're going to go to, at least we have that information. But what the CAS also does, it provides us information early on to start doing means testing. So when a student is still at grade 11 and grade 12, which family they come from, which quintile school they came from, so you can already pre-approve them. If, for instance, they came from a quintile 1, 2 school, that they probably come from a very poor background. Therefore, you need to be ready to provide them with the integrated support. So, and I'll skip this, and I've already spoken about it. So we're looking at promoting the occupations in high demand, incentivizing students, incentivizing institutions, universities, and TVET colleges to offer more spaces for the occupations in high demand. Clearly, it links in with what I was talking about in terms of the production of lecturers, the NGAP and other programs that government has to encourage and increase the capacity in the institutions, in the TVETs, as well as the universities. So we'll be looking at incentivizing employers for offtake agreements, for learnerships, for VET jobs and so on, so that we have a much more integrated way how we're going to provide support to the students. And this is really just part of the verification process. So we're creating a database which is going to link with other databases to make sure that the students that are supported we don't have the current situation where you can simply go and buy an affidavit and declare that your parents are poor, you don't have parents, and you only have your grandmothers, which is often not true. So we're going to eliminate all of that so that we know who we are supporting, that those people that we're supporting who they say they are. The way that it's going to work is, we provide a lot more grant support in the earlier years, more grant support to the poor students, and loans to only those people who, as you progress through the system in the higher academic years of study, as well as if you come from a better-to-do family. This is the social impact bond. So we're looking at raising a significant amount of funding from those people who have patient capital, who are social investors. And the sole purpose of the funding here is going to be to leverage and contribute to the capacity building program that Di was talking about, of strengthening universities, producing academics, providing psychosocial or additional support to students, and making sure that the dropout rates were reduced. It's quite a busy slide, but all that it says is we're looking at raising significant amount of funding to add to government funding. And the main purpose, or maybe the sole purpose of this, is to reduce the dropout rate by providing financial support, academic support, psychosocial support, and so on, so that the progression rates, the success rates, the employability of those students improves over time. So we're looking at running a pilot next year, so we're already in discussions with some of the organizations that are providing social support or wraparound support. These include people like the SAICA, or South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, to Tuga program, the Michael and Susan Adele Foundation, the Rural Education Support Program, REAP, and others. So I already have meetings with them this coming week to talk about how the pilot next year, especially around wraparound support, is going to work, so that we can implement this. And the pilot is going to be testing some of the things that we're talking about here. So we hope to run the pilot only for the missing middle, for occupations in high demand, focusing on a few universities and TVETs, testing for selection, student selection, institution selection, program selection, which faculties we're going to select and so on, and how the contracting is going to work, how the loan grant decision is going to work, and so on and so forth. So, and the pilot, as I indicated, we hope to finish the detailed design of the pilot by the third quarter of this year, so that we're able to roll it out next year. And obviously, on the other hand, NSFAS is accelerating the pilot of the student-centered model. There are elements of the student-centered model that we are going to incorporate in the new way of student support going forward. So we have teams that are working on that. There's a whole lot of work that's taking place, but the key issue here is to improve the chances, to give students a chance, give them a better chance for them to succeed and become meaningful contributors to society. Thank you.
Well, I have heard our previous speaker being referred to as an energy bunny. This is absolutely clear. This has not been a lot of time that he's been in this position, and there is a huge amount of work that has been done. And I think what we have done in this session is really not, we've dealt with the key issues, but also there are some remarkable initiatives that we are embarking on, and we somehow have to put all our energy into ensuring that they do actually take hold. Because if what is up there actually happens, we will be in a remarkably better position. I've been caught as the chair what to do to stop these wonderful speakers or to stop you having tea, and I can't not do either of those things. So there is tea. We are running late, so if I may ask you, if you could be back here at 5 to 11. We have some wonderful treats for you in the next session. So if you could come back as quickly as possible, and could we conclude by giving our wonderful speakers a round of applause.